everybody to this webinar on how to use storytelling in change management. I'm very excited to be joined by Mary Verrone today, who is an expert in change management. The reason I'm excited about this conversation is at Product Maestro, we help leaders with storytelling. And there's nothing more important in change management than making sure you can bring people on board. And storytelling is a key part of that. So I'd like to introduce you to Mary Verrone. She is a global technology leader with 20 years of experience in change management. She worked at Mars, who produces globally recognized brands like M&M, Snickers, Mars Bar, Three Musketeers, Milky Way. I'm sure we've all eaten some of these along the way. And she spent 17 years there. So you can only imagine the number of projects she's been involved in helping them get their project return on investment. And what she does is focus on the people side of the change. Over 93% of the projects that use change management techniques will meet or beat their objectives. But if they don't, then only 15% would be successful. So the change management process she's about to share with us is extremely important for the success of any project, especially around change management. And so I'm very, very pleased to have her join us today and share her process and her experience. Throughout her career, she's managed many business initiatives, including the launch of Dove Fruit. She has seen the need for organizations to realize the benefits of focusing on the people side of the change. So welcome, Mary. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Connie.
Yes. Excellent. So tell us a little bit more about your journey at Mars. What were some of the projects that were notable that you really maybe has interesting stories about the people side of change?
Sure. I worked at Mars, as Connie mentioned, for 18 years, and I was project manager, change manager for most of my career. Probably the biggest change that I remember that I kind of goofed up on. I was launching a CRM project for the Salesforce. I was in sales at the time, and I had a lot of stakeholders, right? Sales team was one of the biggest user groups. There was a side stakeholder group though, HR. And at Mars, you can move from department to department. And I was in the IT department and I moved over to sales to launch the CRM product. I found out that they in sales did not get paid the same time as everybody else in the company. Sales got paid in April. We got paid typically in March, everybody else. I found out that with my CRM implementation, we can give the numbers to the HR department earlier, and then everybody could get paid at the same time. And when I went through the whole project, I didn't really have HR like in the meetings because they weren't involved in the implementation. I would just follow up with them and say, are we still on track to have the sales bonus moved up? And you can probably see where this is going. We launched in December and the bonuses came in April, not March. And I was very sad. I followed up with HR. In the meantime, we had a reorganization. I was moved to a different department outside of sales. And I continued to follow up with the HR group. And what I found out was that I thought it would be easier for them to just do everybody's paychecks all at one time. I thought it would be an easier process. And as processes go, it actually wasn't. They ran the same process that they had run the year before. The next year, the good news is that the process did work and everybody in sales got paid in March like they should, which is what I really wanted. I felt really badly that there's a section of the company that was paid a whole month later than everybody else. And I was so happy that that actually happened, but it taught me that change management is important. The project isn't done when the project launches. It's the it's the implications of the project and how it impacts people. That's really important.
That's a great story. What was the change team that worked with you on this change?
There was no change team.
Ah,
This
okay.
was when change was not really popular. It's only become popular, at least at the Mars organization, in recent years. I'd say probably in the last 3 years or so.
Yeah.
It's gotten a lot more popular recently as people realize that they're missing out on their return on investment because they're not focusing on what happens after a tool or a process is launched, and that
Right.
you really need to support the people.
Good. So this was lesson learned before you ended up having a process. Can you describe a bit about the psychology of the change? And then after that, we can get into more of like the process of the change that you innovated over time.
Yeah, I would say that change is hard and people have a hard time with changing because we know that the pain that we know, and we're oftentimes hesitant to go forward and do something else. I had a project team once, for example, that it was a team of 9 people and they had really, really low engagement scores. I was disappointed with that. I went to Gallup training where that's how we track our surveys and where people's engagement was, because I didn't want to be low and I didn't want my team to be unhappy. The thing that they taught me that I really learned and I use now in life is that they have 12 questions. Focus on one. If you get one question and you nail that, then engagement rises for everything else. And the first question that I saw that looked really easy was, I am given recognition once every 7 days. I can do that, right? I mean, how hard is that? And I changed my ways of working because I wanted to make sure that I could do this. And in the beginning in the morning, I used to come in and immediately start checking my email, heads down into my computer. And instead I stepped away from my desk and I greeted people as they walked in, or if they were there before me, I would go and talk to them. Not necessarily recognition, but just checking in with them. What are they working on? Building that trust. And eventually started recognizing them. And I found out that that wasn't enough.
Okay, so let me recap for a second. So there are 12 questions that you need to nail. And one of the questions is, am I getting encouragement every 7 days?
Recognition. Specifically, am I being recognized within 7 days?
Got it.
So this is part of a game. So what I did was I went to where I did my research and found out that other teams had gamification. And that really helped with changing behaviors. The game is a game, so it's fun, and it had rewards, it had incentives, it had things that people wanted to win.
Yeah.
And that worked really, really well. We had fuzzy dice, we had a little stuffed animal that you would put around and give someone when you wanted to recognize them. And little by little, the team learned to recognize each other. So it wasn't just me, it was everybody recognizing each other. There were 3 things that I learned from my own behavior. It's not good enough, first of all, to say good job. What you really want to do is say, Joe, you did a really good job. And what I really love about it is that you helped me by building this great database show the gaps that we have in pricing actions.
Yeah.
Show the impact, right? That makes sense now, but I didn't know that then. The second thing I learned was to understand what other people are proud of and recognize them for that. For example, Jill's building a brand new report. It took her days and hours of just constant focusing on just that. She was so proud of it. I got the report. I'm like, hey, this looks cool. And that was, I had no idea how much effort went into that. And that's another thing that I had to learn, is that I needed to understand what really was time and effort for them and recognize them for what was important to them, and understand the value.
Yeah.
So those are just examples.
That's a good insight, right? Because as change managers, you often don't see the change journey that someone is on, and you're not in their shoes, right? And so this is a way to be in their shoes and be, hey, look, this change was hard. This change was hard for this person. It was hard for a lot of people, and they had a different journey than me, and is recognizing that. So I love that. When you said the 12 questions, when you say a number, now I want to go through the list, right? So what are the other aspects of the change, the psychology of change that are important?
Oh, so the psychology of change is different than the number of Gallup questions. So 12 were the number of Gallup questions.
Right.
The behavior is when you first come in and you're assessing the change, you look for different things. So there's a mindset change that may need to be addressed, or behavior change, or a process change. I needed to change my process to help HR, right? Get those paychecks out earlier, or to recognize people properly. There's new tools. There's probably about 15 different impacts that you check for to see where people are and what needs to be addressed.
Got it. Got it. So the 12 questions help you assess which area to address, correct?
The 12 questions was a Gallup survey that went out to measure people's engagement.
Oh, okay. Measure people's engagement. Got it. And how often do you administer that? Like you're using it as a litmus test of, is the change working, right?
It depends. Every company does it differently. At that particular time, Mars was doing it every 6 months.
Okay.
And they moved to, I think, every year once people started to understand about engagement and manage their team, manage engagement in their teams. Got
it. So this is the survey that goes out about general engagement with the company and with your job, not specific to that project or that change effort that you're
right. That was an organizational change.
Organizational level. Okay. That's when you do an organizational change. If you're doing small changes, do you do a project level litmus test to see if the change is working, or is that something different?
Ideally, I like them all to be projects because that has a start, it has goals, right? And it has an ending. Yeah. Funding, a team, resources. Ideally, I like, even if it's an organizational change, to have something as a project. A sponsor really helps, those type of things, to make sure that the change actually goes through. I'm also I'm project oriented. I was a project manager for 20 years. I'm very familiar with how it works, so I'm comfortable in that space. But I find that typically it's more successful if you have a structured project where you know what the ROI is supposed to be, so that you know whether you hit it or not hit it.
Do you measure, so ROI is like a lagging indicator, right? Often. Is there a leading indicator that you measure to see, oh yeah, we're on the path, we have enough change happening at the rate we want it to happen? So you're not surprised in 6 months when your ROI didn't come through, right?
Yeah, great question. The indicators that I use, the biggest indicator that I use is something called ADKAR, ADKAR. And ADKAR shows the journey of where people are. Oh. So the first one is awareness. So for example, I was working with a very small company that was made up of mostly freelancers, and we'll just call it Bob's company for now. And in this particular company, the manager or the CEO wanted to have double growth. So he wanted to increase the growth of the sales. Yeah. The challenge was that nobody was aware of that. He had partners that could help him. He had a team that could help him. He didn't tell anybody. So if nobody knows, right, then it's going to be very hard to actually get the ROI that you're planning on getting. That's the first one. So the A in ADKAR stands for awareness. The second one is desire. Do people desire the change? My team did not desire recognizing each other. I'm assuming HR didn't desire the process change for the sales bonus. There are things that have to change, and people changing their processes can be difficult. Incentives, rewards and recognition, having a sponsor. People trust their sponsors, their high executives. people trust their managers. If people are using their managers and their sponsors to incentivize using carrots or sticks, or if they're showing the benefit of changing, then that helps a lot. And that's desire. That's kind of like, dieting. You may be aware that you want to diet and you may desire dieting, but you may not know how. So that's the next one. So I talked about A is awareness, D is desire. The next one's knowledge. K. How do you do it? That's often where training comes in. And the next one is ability. So you have A is awareness, D is desire, K is in knowledge, and then A as in ability. Did I do that one already?
Yeah.
Knowledge and ability. Yeah. So
Knowledge,
that's
ability.
training. We're teaching people how to use a new tool, how to recognize each other. And then the last piece, the piece that's really important that most people don't do, is called reinforcement. And that's making sure that the process doesn't change, making sure that it's not the flavor of the month, that you are actually reinforcing the change, that managers are continuing to follow it. Often what happens is people just wait. They're like, oh, this is going to go away soon and something new will come. I'll just kind of dodge it for a while. But keep reinforcing it, checking that ROI.
Yeah, you got to be able to talk about this soap opera.
Charles, would you go on mute? Here we go.
Thank you.
There we go. Yeah, so the reinforcement ties back to what you said earlier about recognition. And recognition is one way to build that reinforcement. Things sticking around, not, flavor of the month, as you said, which happens a lot in large orgs. What are some other ways to demonstrate this reinforcement?
Rewards help. Recognition helps. There are dashboards that people can use to track how different groups are doing, because not everybody may be at the same point in the change.
Yes.
Helping the people who are stuck, checking in. Why is your group not getting the change while others are?
Right.
Things like that.
Right. That's great. And so what do you see, where do you see projects usually fail? I feel like projects are usually really good at the knowledge ability, right? And some are good at the awareness, right? They're like, oh, we got to tell people, and then we got to train people. And then they end there, right? So the desire, I feel like, in reinforcement tends to fall short. And is that that's my instinct, is that right?
You're spot on, Connie. Often people will say, they'll send out a communication, but it won't have the benefit in it. And that's important. People want to know, what am I going to get out of this? What's in it for me?
Right.
The desire is big because a lot of companies just assume that people will do as they're told.
Yeah.
They don't do anything else other than just say, hey, go do it. Right. They may not even plan how you're going to do it. If, for example, there's a new tool coming out and there's an old tool that's already better, maybe it's just Excel, people don't really want to move to the new tool, even though that new tool is supposed to be great, interacts with other systems. It's probably worth, $40 million. People don't necessarily want to do that. But if you tell them it's going to be faster, it's going to be less work, it's going to give you better analysis, then that really helps as well.
Yeah.
And then to your point, reinforcement, often people think once the project's done or once the tool's out there, then we're done, right? That's not necessarily the case. People need help. They need support. If the support goes away and they get stuck, they'll just go back to the old process. Right. They'll be like, oh, I can't do this anymore, and just stop.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So at Product Maestro, I work on storytelling with leaders. And this point about desire really resonates with me, because traditionally we had a lot more top-down organizations where people didn't work on desire. They're just like, okay, you got a paycheck, that's your desire. So if you desire a paycheck, do this, right? And it doesn't work. I mean, it's worked somewhat, but it doesn't truly work, right? People need to come in with their own desire, their own motivation. And so I find when I work with a lot of leaders who are trying to get their team to move in a certain direction together, the ability for them to be good storytellers is so important, because they need to spark that desire with people. They need to make it so that it makes sense for that person to move forward with the project that they're pitching, right? And increasingly, people, employees, teams are desiring this desire piece, right? They want their work to be meaningful to their lives. They don't want to just have a paycheck. Like, this is a requirement of the current workforce. So it's a very interesting kind of tie in with what you're describing here. And change management is happening literally all the time. Like, the pace of change has been measured to have increased. I mean, we all felt it this year in particular, right?
Yes.
So yeah, I think at the intersection of those two are really interesting to think about. How long would you typically say you need to do that reinforcement? Like, help, because you're saying, oh, if you kind of send it out there and then disappear, people are going to revert back, right? So how long do you need to kind of push this wagon along before you can be like, oh, we're good here, the wagon's moving on its own? Is there a time frame? Is there kind of measurements you do to know when you can just let it go on its own? How do you think about that?
I'll answer the second question first.
Yeah.
Yes, if you have measurements, it makes it a lot easier. If you have an adoption rate of 90, 95, 100%, that makes it very easy. The first question was, oh gosh, now I forgot.
Time frame. Do you,
Timeframe,
are
yes.
you like when you walk into a project, you're like, they tell you, I need to make this change. And you're like, okay, I can help you. It'll take 3 months, right? Like, is there a time that it's kind of minimum? I know it varies, right? But like, given your experience, what is that time that people should expect?
It depends, Connie. The interesting thing is when you first come in and you do an assessment on an organization, if an organization is change agile, if people are trusting of their management and they desire the change, then it'll move very quickly and you won't need that much reinforcement. So those kind of companies are fast and nimble. You probably can guess who they are because Zoom is probably one of them. Amazon might be one. Google
quick?
is one, right? They move fast. Apple's another one.
How do you define quick? Is that like a month?
I'm sorry?
How do you define quick? Is that like a month?
It could be days.
Wow.
Because if you do it right and you do it with the right change management techniques, you have the right sponsorship, you have managers on board, people desire it.
Yeah.
For example, when I got my new expense system and I didn't have to write out my expenses, all I had to do was take a picture of my receipt. Right. Boom, I was like, I never went back.
Yes.
And you didn't have to reinforce me.
Right. Self-reinforcing. Yeah. Could be days, but if you don't have the desire or some of the other components there, then it would take a lot longer. What's the hairiest project you've had to work on? And how long did that one take?
Hairiest meaning like the most difficult?
Toughest, very resistant workforce, didn't want to change it. There was zero desire. Maybe not enough sponsorship. I don't know. What were the broken pieces like of a project that maybe a project that failed, or maybe a project that was close to failing, right? Like, what were some of the things that happened there?
One of the things that I did was I brought the S&OP process, which stands for Sales and Operations Planning. Mm-hmm. It's a popular process in manufacturing. It works great on the business side because it's basically measuring sales, which the salespeople bring in, and what the manufacturers can manufacture. And reconciling the two, because often salespeople can sell more than what the company can actually make.
Right.
And that's the process. And I brought it on over to the IT side because I saw that there was a need for there to be a reconciliation between the number of projects and the number of resources. Mm-hmm. It was a global implementation. And I had support. My director was behind it. I had the sponsorship. I had the funding. The challenge was that when I did it on a small scale in the chocolate side of the business, It was just Americas. Everybody was in the time zone, same time zone.
Yeah.
When you go global, it's
Oh.
that much more complicated and that many more people. And then the other thing I realized was that it's about people, and people are harder to loan out, so to say, right? So if you only have a certain number of people, but you have lots of projects, and you have to put a person on a project, people are a lot more hesitant to do that quickly compared to a manufacturing line. If Twix needs the manufacturing line and M&M needs the manufacturing line, they can usually come to an agreement.
Yeah.
It's harder with people because your person could get, I don't want to say damaged is the word, but their reputation could suffer.
Right.
Which has a lot of impacts. And also as a manager, you want to make sure that your resources there when you need them.
Right.
And you may not think that's a good project. So that was kind of the struggle that I had. It did fail. What I did was I knew it was a problem. I suggested that we have a design thinking session in Brazil and brought all the key players in and had them all figure out we all knew what the problem was. We couldn't make decisions. And they came up with a design. My management team took that design away, came back, and then we implemented a process that actually worked. But yeah, it fails more often than it succeeds, I think.
Yeah, very interesting. What other insights from the global aspect was challenging? Like, was there a translation issue? Like the desire is different, I imagine. Like, what are some of the other pitfalls that if you were to do it over again, you would pay attention to?
One of the things that surprised me was that when I did car analysis in Asia, the people there put everything as green right away. And I'm not sure if that is because they were really receptive, or if there was a translation, or if they were just good to go. Long story short, they implemented very quickly. And so that was good. But compared to the UK and the Americas, they were so much faster. And I was surprised by that. And I think that's a cultural thing. The Americas and the UK folks question more, and it's not a bad thing, but it slows things down a bit. I think it's a good thing because it makes you sure that what you're actually implementing does do what you want it to do, and it'll make everybody happy. That was the biggest challenge I had. The second biggest challenge I had was, of course, globally. Once we designed this SNOP, I'm calling it that, meeting, the thing that we did was, the challenge that I had was that I had pets. So I had the pet segment to go live. And the challenge I had was that nobody wanted to be going to this meeting at 2:00 in the morning. And that's really hard to do when you have a global team.
Yeah.
And a lot of times you find that people will help you solve your problems for you. So I saw this one coming, and I talked to the folks in Asia Pac, and they felt that their regional process was going really, really well. What I did was, when I suggested the overall process and my recommendations, my suggestion was that the Asia Pac team continue to do this process regionally. And then if they had to escalate it to the rest of the global meeting. And then maybe that one meeting that Asia Pac people have to attend, they change the time or they do something different, but it would be a one-off. And that got agreement very quickly.
That's great. That's great. What are some of because we talk about storytelling in my community, right? And in product management, there's a lot of similarities too. My background's in product. There's constantly a need to gather people and move in the same direction. That's ultimately what, right? And so we do that in product too. And a lot of what you said really resonates. And And I have my way of doing storytelling to kind of spark this energy with everybody. What are some kind of storytelling opportunities? How do you approach the, we're talking more about the awareness and desire part, right? It's like, how do you tell people? How do you spark that desire? What are some kind of techniques you've learned along the way that you can share with us?
I would say that when I do storytelling all the time, constantly.
I'm sure.
Change management is hard and people need to understand a story. Some of the best stories that I've used that people really get are the challenges that I've had. For example, I had a hard time at first accepting that I would have to wear a mask. And when I explain the story, I tell people, I was aware that wearing a mask during COVID, during a pandemic, was a good thing to do. By the way, I never leave my house except to go on bike rides or something. So I don't really go out much. I don't go to the store or anything. I have things delivered or my husband gets it. The desire for me, and I don't know why it was that I didn't want to wear a mask, but I just didn't want to do it. And then finally I was like, all right, I saw Andrew Cuomo on TV. He's not my governor, but I was fascinated in his change management process. And he's like, why not wear a mask? Save lives. I'm like, he's right. Like, this is silly. Why won't I just put a mask on my head? So I did. And then I had that design. Then I got stuck because I couldn't get a mask, right? You'd order one on Etsy and then it would the order would be like, oh no, sorry, we're all sold out. You're like, so my daughter she made one for me with a sewing kit that she had. It's really cute. It's a little Star Wars mask. And then what I do, I have it over there, but when I tell the story at work, I often show me trying to put it on, and the elastic that she has doesn't fit my head.
Right.
So what I have to do is put my hair up in a ponytail and then put the elastic around my ponytail. And that's the knowledge and ability, right? So the knowledge is, where do I get a mask? The ability is, how do I get this darn thing to fit? And then reinforcement is what I'm still stuck on today. It's hard because it's been so many months. I have several masks now. I have one by the front door. I have one in my jacket. Just sometimes if something happens, somebody comes to the door, sometimes I forget to put it on. Anything that happens outside of my normal process gets me. And that's one of the stories that I tell. So I find that if I use a story about me and not about them and the struggles that I went through that often other people could relate to, that often helps a lot.
I see. I love that you showed up doing the live demo, right? Like, watching you struggle is probably the most inspiring for people, because we all struggle with it. Yeah, it's funny, and it's endearing. It's like, I get it, and I can see that, and so you're trying, and maybe I should try too. So yeah, I think that's a great way to kind of bring people on board. So thanks for sharing that. I wanted to open up the floor to the audience here. If you have questions for Mary, please type them into the chat, and we'll get some more interesting insights from her here. So, and while people are thinking about their questions, I'd love to explore the macro versus micro of change management. Because you have company level change, right? Where you have probably a lot more sponsorship, a lot more just eyeballs on it, awareness, everything. So it's likely to be more supported and hopefully more successful. I don't know. You can tell me if it is or not. And then there's micro changes. Like, most of us are within a group, a subgroup within a larger company, right? And there are changes within this that may actually conflict what the macro changes are, or at least is getting less attention. So, and I'm sure you've worked in both scenarios. How do you, first, what are some insights about kind of how they're different? And then how do you, if you're in the micro situation, how do you make sure your small change effort, which is never a small change effort, but your more contained change effort is going to be successful?
I would say it's the scale. When I have an organizational change that I want to introduce, I will go to the president or the CEO and ask for their support. every time I've done that so far, it's actually worked. You have to be prepared, of course, but that's really important to have that CEO or president on your side to help you clear the roadblocks and to give you funding and whatever you need.
Got it.
The smaller projects, you still need that sponsor. You need somebody who's influential, somebody who will help clear those roadblocks. And I find that surprisingly, those are harder to get. It depends on the organization, of course. Some organizations are very collaborative. Other ones are very hierarchy based. And those can be a little bit more of a struggle. The big thing though, is that in order for a change to go through, having the sponsor, having a sponsor and having the managers involved and the change network involved really, really helps. It's just the scale. How big is your change network compared to the different kind of project that you're on?
I see. So regardless, you need to have that sponsor. What if your sponsor isn't the president? What if, say, the VP of marketing is sponsoring and it's more or less contained in marketing, but of course it's going to bleed over, right? Do I, as a change manager, need to go get the president's approval also before we proceed, or is the VP of marketing's blessing enough?
I guess it depends on how collaborative the organization is. If people work in silos or they work together, I usually don't. I encourage the sponsors to interact because they're both stakeholders then.
Right.
And you want them to agree. And it might be an easy thing. Maybe somebody from the other department, HR, for example, may be totally on board and maybe they'll see the benefit of it and it's not even a problem. Just have to remember to follow up with them.
Yeah. Very cool. Hey, we have a question. As a change manager, what tips do you have in creating and communicating the value proposition of the shift that you're trying to make?
Great question. I would say the number one thing is the WIFM. What's in it for me? What's that benefit? Communications are great. Make sure that they're going out to everybody who's impacted. The challenge is to make sure that you have in there a benefit that people can relate to. What we should have done for that sales example that I gave you is talk about the project and how people's bonuses would go up a month if we could get it implemented.
Right.
We didn't think about that. We were thinking just about the tool and what the tool can give.
Right.
And it's better to kind of step back and say, what is it that the people are really going to benefit from?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I do this with my storytelling class students, actually, is take the story. There's like all these different aspects of the story. And when you're working on the problem, like you've already answered it for yourself. So you're fine. You're like, I'm totally desiring this change. And then you forget all the pieces, because that's what happens is you gather the data and then you are convincing yourself, you're convinced, and then you discard the data. But that data is still useful for everybody else who hasn't made that change journey yet, as you have, right? Because you're on a different path, part of the change journey. And so like I work with the students to, okay, gather all those pieces. Here's a template. Go gather all those pieces. And most of it is just out of their heads. They're like, oh yeah, this one, yeah. Okay, well now here's the whole story. And you need to make sure you can use the story with your stakeholders, right? And make sure that they also get a chance to be on this journey with you and kind of make those steps of change with you. So yeah, that's great. Dr. Carol is asking a question here. What if you know the changes the organization needs, but the head of the organization is the biggest person resisting?
That happens a lot. It depends on the person. What I find most helpful is the ROI conversation, return on investment, especially if it's been a very expensive project or initiative. It's easier to get them on board if you say, or you can talk about past failures as well, right? We spent $12 million on this particular tool 5 years ago, and now you want to spend $24 million on a new tool. And do you really need to? Is it because they didn't adopt the old one, or is it because the old one, we bought just a really bad tool? Usually what happens is the tool was okay, and they either didn't check in with the people, or they didn't do that reinforcement piece at the end. And instead of going back and fixing that problem, it's easier to just go and buy a new system. And what I would say is that if that happened in the past, I would bring that back and say, do we want that to happen again this time? Here's what we need. That usually works. It depends on the person. I worked with a really small, I'm a consultant, and I worked with a really small company, and the CEO was very resistant to that awareness piece. And he was happy to talk to partners about things, about building his company, but he was hesitant to talk to his own people. And it was because he really didn't have a plan on how to do that. And that's harder because I had to figure out what the problem was, because he would just say no. You have to ask a lot of questions, the 5 whys, that kind of a thing, to figure out what's going on in someone's head.
Yeah. That is a tough one. Seems like if that happens, then 100% of your effort ought to be getting this person over the line, right?
Oh yeah,
Because
absolutely.
you can't move forward otherwise. So that's cool. Since we're working, so Ian is asking, since we're working remotely and will for a while, how do you stay in touch without being a micromanager?
Great question, Ian. I have found that Zoom, or I should say working remotely, still works. I feel like sometimes there's fatigue by being on camera all the time. I often don't stay on camera. I will use other avenues. I'll use my phone, I'll text, I'll chat. I check in with people on a daily basis. That often helps a lot, as opposed to going a week without talking to somebody. I keep it friendly. Sometimes, like I was doing that today with my coworkers, just sharing pictures back and forth. And those kind of things help still build a relationship. It's harder for sure, I think, than when you're not seeing people face to face and you have to work a bit harder. I think it's still possible. I questioned whether I'd be able to do my latest change initiative remotely. And I've been working remote even when I was at Mars, but it wasn't 100%. And then I thought back and I'm like, when I did that pet implementation, it was global and nobody in my office was actually on that team. So I can do it remotely. I just need to be careful and make sure that I use all the avenues that are possible for me to make sure that people are engaged and to check in with people, right? Are you tired of having your video on? I found that that's pretty popular right now. People feel like they're always on, and that's hard.
Yeah, that's hard.
I hope that helped, Ian.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mary.
No, you're welcome.
All right. Sandy has a question. And Dr. Carol also came back and said thank you. She will try some of the techniques that you shared about moving the leader of the company into being positive about the change. So Sandy is asking, at what stage in the project does change management generally come in? As a PMP, it usually came in after implementation launch to ensure the changes followed. But at what stage in your experience does it generally come in?
I have a PMP too. I would go back to, it's the same as a project, and it shouldn't be at the end. It should be in the very beginning. When we build that charter, it should have in there, what's the adoption rate? What goal do we want to hit? Is it 100%? Because what I found is if you don't have that pre-planning piece, then you're always running to catch up. And change is the same as a lot of the other initiatives. You have to plan it in advance. You have to do that assessment. You have to have it as part of the charter. You have to get everybody on board in the beginning. And you want that sponsor to be interacting with the project team and make sure the project team knows adoption is also what they're tracking. It's not about just you launching a great product. It's making sure that people use it. And if you're not thinking about the end users, then there's less chance of success. So I say from the very beginning, and unfortunately, change managers are brought in usually when things are failing or when you're in the middle of things. The best place to do it is in the very beginning, when you're figuring out what that change is, how hard is it going to be, so that you can have the right number of resources and, things like that a project manager thinks about, but they're forgetting about the adoption piece. I hope that helps, Sandy.
Yeah, I think often people don't know that they're on a change journey, right?
Yeah.
Often things are just moving along. We're not making a change. And then suddenly it's big enough to be a change, to be a project where a change manager is needed. So then at some point they're like failing at it. Then they pull in a change manager, right? That's probably when you get pulled in. You're like, wait, you could just call me 3 months ago. But that's the reality, is they don't even know that they needed you until that point. So how do you course correct when that happens?
I do as much as I can. I still do the assessment. I figure out where people are. Often they're stuck in awareness or desire when I first come on. And then I look to see what the barriers are. Are we asking people to do something that they really don't want to do? Okay. Are we asking people to do something that they have no idea even exists? And then I work with teams to change that. Yeah. Do we need to have better communications? A lot of times I come in, people don't know what the benefit is. And then we spend time on that. So there's different, depends on where they are stuck, but often that can be fixed. It's just talking to the users, seeing where they're stuck, and then getting sometimes the organization to change the way they're doing things to make sure that it works for everybody.
That's great. Have you ever used the kind of keystone story or the trigger story to move? Because often, especially on a larger change effort, right? People need an event to point to say, oh, this is why we're making the shift, right? Like we have a virus now, that's why everybody has to wear a mask, right? Like there is a kind of a story behind, because why else would you change your behavior, right? So sometimes that story comes readily because there is a thing, but sometimes it's a complex issue, right? There are multiple reasons that's causing us to make this shift, and it's too complicated or it may be impossible, right? Some of those are hunches, some of those are data, some of the there's just a lot going on. How often do you have to use this kind of keystone? I don't know what you call it, but I call it like the keystone story, right? This technique of kind of helping build that narrative so people can be like, okay, this thing, that's why we're doing it.
That's really a helpful thing. Often in businesses, it's about the market, what's going on in the marketplace, what are the trends? Do we need to get better at something? Is Hershey doing really well, or did Hershey miss Halloween during their ERP implementation and we just need to be careful in our implementation? There are things that are going on that are changing. Often what I go to is what are they from a perspective of ROI, or what are they trying to do from a financial perspective? Because often it ties back to finances. And that's often a trigger. We didn't do well this quarter, or we're doing great, but in this one customer, Walmart, for example, or Amazon, we're not doing well, we're losing share. What do we need to do? And those things often help. Yeah. The awareness is key though. People need to know what's going on, where are we failing? Maybe we're shipping things too early, or maybe we're shipping things too late. For Twix PB, you can't sell in Hawaii because it takes too long to get there because we make it in South America. So it's really some of those things you just kind of have to understand to really pull it all together and make sure that people can relate to it. People may not understand customs, but if you tell them that you are sending a recipe down there and it's sitting there for 24 days, they get that. They're like, oh, that's going to go bad in that hot sun. And that's the pieces that you have to do, right? And when you're telling a story. Yeah. Help them relate to it. That's a very good point. And Sandy also has a good point here. She's asking, what if you can't tell the team why the change is necessary because of confidentiality? I had a project like that. I was on a retirement project and I had to give presentations on it and I couldn't say anything. And I would joke about things like, if I tell you, I'm going to have to kill you type of things. And it was hard. It's very hard, but there's always a way to help people usually. So for this retirement, I couldn't tell them anything about what was going on and what we were planning, but I could talk about the problem. And the problem was that we were spending so much money on retirement plans because in the current rules, the factory workers could work overtime and get a higher retirement package. And what they would do, the rumor was that they would schedule it so that whoever was retiring could get the most overtime, and they would give their shifts to this person. And this person who might be making $50,000 a year would end their last year making $100,000, and their retirement is inflated compared to me, who's making, I don't know, maybe $70,000 a year. And then when I retire, I'm still going to be making only 70,000 because I don't have that way of going, that process that they had. So if you talk about things not being fair, then that often resonates with people. But it is tricky. It is tricky.
Cool. Any parting thoughts?
For me?
Yeah. Anything
Sure.
you're working on you want to tell people about, or wisdom you want to share?
Yeah, I would say there's plenty of resources out there. Also on LinkedIn, you can follow me on LinkedIn. If you have any questions, I'm happy to point you to other resources, or I have sites where I can point you to get a lot of other information. I'm always free, so you can ping me on LinkedIn. I work for a consulting company, and we are often looking into how we can help other people with their problems, because a lot of times people have, it's not just change management, it might also be like a project management problem where the project managers are going agile, but they haven't learned how to do agile yet. Those kind of things to just help people.
Yeah,
And,
fantastic.
no, thank you for having me. I like to tell people about change management because a lot of people don't know about it yet.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.